closings for
I'm gonna go on.
West Side agents. Closely with the security team, and so we've been running into this a couple times.
Zoom about Airbnb stuff.
What's that?
You just tell Ryan to mute himself.
Yeah. Ryan, mute yourself, please.
Ryan, can you hear me?
We could go up to the corner and mute.
Oh, he did.
Fine.
He won't be.
So, we've been running into this problem with Airbnbs, and I think it's a good time to cover it before, the spring market hits. Also, I've been seeing a lot more of bank-owned properties. So specifically for, younger agents that haven't seen those, because we haven't seen them in years. You're gonna be seeing a lot more of those, so just cover the basics of a bank-owned property contract and what the differences are gonna be. And then I've been doing, evictions for the office for a while. I started with John Maka
And it starts like,
prior to joining Block Longo. And so, the sort of a rundown of the basics of an eviction. So if you have a listing or representing a buyer that has a tenant in the property, you know what to expect, at least generally speaking. So starting first with Airbnbs, and certainly interject, anybody watching on the call, certainly interject. If there's, I don't have a PowerPoint, so it's meant to be more of a conversation. And I want to address questions as they arise, so feel free to interject with questions. But starting first with Airbnb, so the problem we're running into, and what I want to make sure that we're all on the same page about, is initially, the thought with Airbnbs was the default position was they're permissible. So if you're representing a buyer and they want to rent it on Airbnb, it was an afterthought, don't worry about it, that shouldn't be an issue. Within the last roughly 6 months, we've taken a 180 really, and now I would expect that if your client wants to, if you're representing a buyer and your client wants to rent it on Airbnb, I would go in with the understanding that they're not permissible. And we need the proof from the seller and the listing agent and the seller's attorney that you're going to be able to do that. So you really should build it into the contract up front. And so go ahead.
Sorry, I don't want to interrupt.
No, it's all good.
So, what's proof?
Just sitting in on a meeting.
Proof is going to be, I'm sorry, if there's anybody watching, if there's a way to mute yourself, just thank you. Don't mean to be rude, but it's just cutting through, so. So proof is going to be approval from the town, typically with permits. So essentially what's happening is I was just listening on the radio today, and if you were receiving payment on any of the payment apps on your phone, the last 3 years, there's been no way of tracking that with the IRS. And now, as of this year, anything that's over $600 is going to be trackable. So the law is very much delayed with the phone apps and what people are able to do. And that's now relevant with Airbnbs and VRBOs, is now they're catching up. And so what the towns are doing is, if you were grandfathered in before with a permit, a lot of times that permit is going to be transmissible or transferable to a buyer. But if you weren't, the towns are going on a blanket denial on permits for Airbnbs. So the question becomes, if you have a buyer that doesn't disclose this up front and you're representing that buyer, and you submit an offer, and if your buyer is expecting a certain rate of return, they might be willing to overpay for a property. They might be willing to put a big deposit down. And then after the conversation, maybe with attorneys, after the contract gets approved, sometime prior to closing, it comes out in discussion that your buyer wants to rent it on Airbnb. At that point, the contingencies have been satisfied and the buyer has to close. Well, it might be too late to get your buyer out of the transaction. And so that's where this is becoming a problem. And so what I really want to do is try to get out in front of, when agents are representing buyers, if you have an intake form and you have questions with respect to what your buyer's looking for, I would make sure that one of the initial questions are, do you intend to rent this on Airbnb? So you could make the contingency in the contract that it needs to be permissible from the town. And then back to your question, what is proof? Some towns might not have a blanket denial. They might not even require a permit, so proof might not exist. We're in a little bit of a changing of the guards where it seems like downstate in New York City, they were the first to do this and issue just a blanket denial of permits. And then it's all getting caught up. The towns are getting caught up. The one town is copying from another town as to what they're doing. And so where we've seen this is in the town of Greece. Now, for any agents watching from Buffalo, I understand that there can be clauses in the contract that might protect a buyer that are different from Monroe County bar contracts. So I don't want to give a blanket rule throughout the state. Certainly you can email me and we have partners in the Buffalo office that we could address any concerns you might have. But here specifically in Monroe County, those clauses don't really exist. There's some general clauses that you could try to get, wiggle room out of, but really your buyer's gonna be in trouble. And then the next step, so if you're representing a buyer who gets a property under contract, gets it approved, and then after signing of the contract or prior to closing, you find out that they can't rent the property on Airbnb, and there's no contingency in the contract to get them out. The next step is to just disclose that, hey, we wanted to rent this out on Airbnb, we can't, we need to back out. Well, now you run into the next problem, which is, what is your client's liability? And if they overpaid for the property and they've made a large deposit, not only do they run the risk of losing their deposit, but they run the risk of potentially being sued by the seller for the difference in the purchase price. And if your buyer was, let's say, willing to pay $450 for a house that was only worth $410 because they expected a certain rate of return, and that seller goes to relist the property and now only sells it for $410 or maybe even less because it's now been 3 months or 2 months or a month listed, they're going to be liable for $450, but now they're only liable for, now they're going to be liable not only for their deposit, but the difference between what that seller is now selling it for, which may be much less. So ultimately, the idea here is to go in, proceed with caution, assume you cannot list the property on Airbnb or rent it out on Airbnb. And if a buyer is interested in that, particularly on expensive property, it's gonna be on lakefront property, either on Ontario or Canandaigua or any other of the various lakes, be aware. And then even if the town is right now saying, well, we don't have a blanket denial in place, so you're good to go, I would disclose to your client that, hey, as your realtor, we're in a gray area and the times seem to be changing. And the towns throughout the state do not like Airbnbs. And so just because you could rent it on Airbnb this year or within the next 3 years, if the town changes and they go on a, let's say, an annual permit basis, you might not be grandfathered in. So it's something to consider. That just to cover your rear on that. We don't want anybody over promising on what you can and can't do with this property. So that's really the first, go ahead.
Sorry, you mentioned Greece and I may have missed it. What's going on with the town of Greece?
Well, have a blanket denial on right now on permits for Airbnbs.
Did that, and what was it before? So they didn't have anything, now they have a blanket.
They had permits, and so you can apply for a permit. And so some properties have been grandfathered in, but my understanding is it's a very small number. It could be less than 30. Could be even less than that, could be less than 10. And then particularly on Edgemere Drive, there's been a lot of complaints. And so the town has said, no, we're denying them across the board.
That makes perfect. I was at an open house with someone over the weekend and it was an Airbnb. And so now they're trying to sell it. And they didn't want any signage, they didn't want any publication of other than the MLS. And I couldn't figure out what it was. That is probably what they're dealing with.
So just, yes, and so anybody that can't hear on the microphone, I'm not sure if you can, but there's a property on Edgemere Drive, which for the realtors out in Buffalo, that's going to be on Lake Ontario. And it seemed to be they weren't disclosing everything about the Airbnb, and they probably know something now, maybe as a result of another deal dying. What I will say, as the attorney representing various buyers, because this has happened on more than one of my transactions, it's hard to get your client's deposit back. And in one of the transactions, the seller was actually had a tenant, if you want to call him that, renting on Airbnb in the property when the buyer's agent showed the property to the buyer. So the buyer's agent knew that the buyer wanted to rent it on Airbnb, but that there was somebody renting on an Airbnb, working on Amazon in the property. So they were going with the impression that this was safe to do, we're good to go. And whether or not the seller knew that was not allowed is hard to say. Essentially, what the town will do, if you're in violation of the town's rules, is they will send you a letter, ask you to cease and desist, and then if you don't, they'll send you fines. But it's not exactly public record that you're in violation with the town's code on something like an Airbnb. So it takes some digging by the buyer's attorney, some calling to the town, which is why you really got to build into the contract. This is subject to the approval from the town to be able to rent on Airbnb. We want it in writing. And don't rely on general clauses or MLS listings where they might lie or kind of manipulate the truth. I would build it right in. Did you have a question? I'm sorry. go ahead.
Well, the other thing is too, is you were talking about proof, and just because they have proof that they earned income from Airbnb to show that that it was a rental is not necessarily that they have a permit.
Yes.
So keep that in mind.
Yeah. So for anyone listening on the video, proof meaning from the town, not from the
history.
profit and loss statement.
PDF of the seller.
Not from the third party.
Yeah.
So we're using Airbnb, but we're talking about like any short-term rental. here,
Yes.
right? What, is there like a specific guideline of what a short-term rental is? Is it anything under a year? Is it?
Well, that's a good question. Ultimately, I believe short-term rentals are gonna be daily.
If they
Because,
pay daily for
Yes,
per diem?
yes,
Okay.
when you go on Airbnb, you're gonna be able to essentially rent a property on a per day basis.
Yeah, yeah,
You can sign leases are month to month. If you don't sign something,
Yeah.
if it's verbal.
Yeah.
It's month to month. So I would think at that point, then if doing evictions myself. There are plenty of month to month tenancies that go up in front of the judge
sure.
that are not required to be a special permit. So I would think that would be the cutoff, but no, there's not, because this is so new and
Yeah.
the law is so slow to get caught up. That there isn't an exact breakdown.
Okay.
That was gonna be my follow-up question was, what's considered the term that you're using because we're so new, it's Airbnb. But on Airbnb, you can rent for 3 days, 2 days, a week, a month, several months. What is the town, if we know, how are they defining that that's a Airbnb rental? Like, if it goes 3 days, is it still an Airbnb rental or?
So here.
That's what I'm trying to figure out.
Yes, no, and that's a great question. I don't have an exact answer,
I didn't think so.
partly because the town's rules are gonna vary on a town by town basis. So the definitions of these terms are not gonna be the same throughout the state. Which is why it's so important to build a contingency upfront,
Mhm.
because to rent something on a month-to-month basis, even if it's on Airbnb, is what most landlords do anyways.
Mhm.
So that, it's not so much, in that case, are you renting on Airbnb? Now, Airbnb can be very expensive. I think it might be hard to rent on a month-to-month basis on Airbnb. But it's not so much that are you using Airbnb, it's the timeline with which you're renting the property. And really what we're getting at here, obviously, is, look, if you have an affluent area on a lake and somebody is renting the property out on Airbnb and there are parties there, because you're renting the property out just for one night on a Saturday.
Yeah.
And it's disturbing everyone else's use of the property, they're calling the town's saying enough with this, we're getting too many calls on this. And that's where this is being generated from. So I do think that there will continue to be changes because, not to get too far off topic, but look, the taxi lobby did not want Uber. And so New York State for a long time was denying Uber, and now we have Uber. So eventually there might be a change to where Airbnb is allowed throughout the state, and this is just a temporary thing. But as of right now, you need to know, as a realtor, if you're talking to a buyer, they might not disclose to you up front that they want to rent it on Airbnb. You might not even think this is a property that would be rentable on Airbnb, okay? It might not be lakefront. It's a question that you should ask every buyer upfront. Go
What
ahead.
about the city?
The city's not allowing them either. On particular properties, I do think single-family residences, they are. On, commercial units or anything over 2 units, I don't think they are. But it's, the city's not able to crack down on it as much because there isn't the neighborly calling and of the town to enforce this rule. There's obviously a lot more rentals in the city, and so whether or not you're renting it on a lease or on Airbnb is harder to determine than on Edgemere Drive.
I just want,
Yeah, go ahead, sorry.
Is the key word there lease? If there's a client that actually has short-term rentals, but they only do it with a lease in minimum 30-day stay, is that considered short-term or not?
Yes, so this gets back to the definition, and so the definition of short-term rental is gonna be on a town-by-town basis, because they're the ones that get to dictate these rules. But if you are renting on a month-to-month basis, that is not considered a short-term rental throughout the state, because those are, any lease that's verbal or any lease that's expired has gone month to month. So that is going to be allowed throughout the state on a month-to-month basis. So as a general rule, it would be anything less than a month-to-month, but it's gonna vary on a town-by-town basis. I'm sorry, another question?
I just went to, the city of Rochester. They had a meeting, a town meeting. I think it was like either last week, and this was the third one in regards to one topic was Airbnb, and I think they are coming out with some type of ruling on what they're going to do forthcoming.
Well, yeah, and I do know there have been clients that have commercial property, more than 2 units, essentially. It's not a 30-unit building, but it's more than 2. And they applied for a permit and the city denied them. Now, again, whether or not the city is able to enforce that rule, it's different. The towns have less going on. But yes, and if there's any questions on the Zoom, feel free to just unmute yourself and interject here. Go ahead.
Just one other question. Is there, it sounds like the city of Rochester, do they have a specific permit for Airbnb, or are you just getting a C of O?
No, it's going to be a specific permit.
It's going to be a specific permit
Yep.
in the city
Yep.
used for Airbnb.
Yep. Again, it's a lot harder to enforce in the city, that's all. So for the most part, people have been operating, not following the rules because the city does not have the manpower to figure out who's renting on Airbnb and who's renting on a lease or written lease. But in the smaller towns on the lakefront, it's rather obvious when there are, seems to be new people in there on every weekend and parties are being thrown and it's been a disturbance to the community. So that's really where we're seeing the issues.
Do you know, is there going to be a different permit for short-term rentals versus just regular rentals? Because I think in the
Yeah.
town of Arundequoit, you have to get a rental permit if you're going to rent out your property,
Yep.
but.
Well, I would assume, so
Or
I would assume for
SDRs.
every town that there's going to be a separate permit. They might not be caught up yet,
Okay,
but they're going there. And then that's where they're doing the blanket denial.
Yeah, this is Allison. I heard that if you rent out your private residence as an Airbnb, the town has no recourse against you or ruling over you if it's your private residence. What
No.
is your take on that?
No, the town does have the ability. And again, this is. I do think that there might be cases that go all the way up to the Supreme Court over this, so this is a fluid thing, but as of right now, the town does have the ability to deny your ability to rent on Airbnb, and that's the issue. That's the issue, is that people are buying property. They're moving out of state. They're buying property in a nice location with the understanding that I'm gonna rent it for 9 months of the year, reserve some weeks to come back from Florida or wherever I'm moving to spend time with my family, and that's where they're running into problems. The town absolutely has the right to deny your ability to rent on Airbnb. That's the issue.
Okay, thanks.
What's
Yeah.
the recourse though? Like, what can they possibly do, fine you?
They would fine you.
Okay.
They would fine you and then it would, the fines would accumulate. And if you don't pay them, in theory, they could attach a lien to the property and worst case scenario, foreclose. Of course, this is contingent on people calling the town on you. So if you were to rent it out and no neighbors knew, then in theory, you could do this under the radar for years. But the problem is they have every right to enforce it. Go ahead.
People have been doing that forever. You know, they buy a lake property, they rent it out for X months out of the year or whatever to help pay for their taxes or whatever the reason. So what's different now? I mean, is it because they're listing it on Airbnb? Like, what if you just put it on Facebook? Or what if you just word of mouth and you're renting your property 6 weeks out of the year? Like, where is that line drawn?
Well, the line is drawn with the definition of short-term rental. And so now with Airbnb, it allows you to rent for a night. And then what's happening is again, these parties, that's really the problem, is that when you only rent a really nice house for a Saturday night, presumably it's not because you're going there with your wife and kids just for a quiet evening. They're throwing parties and then the neighbors are getting upset. And so the town is saying, well, you know, we can't, it's too much of a nuisance. We have to cut it off. If you're gonna rent it out on a month-to-month basis, we don't have the power to do that. But on a short-term rental, it's a different zoning. They're basically relying on zoning laws and saying this is now turned into from a normal property to a hotel, if you will. And you're not zoned for that. And that's what they're relying on. Now, again, some people are overpaying for the property. And so you might be able to make the claim to the town or in the courts that this is a taking that's put you in a bad financial position. And that might be where this goes to go up through the courts to where the Supreme Court could rule on this, because that's where this is headed. Somebody's gonna have to make a ruling. I personally, as an attorney that does real estate, I think that this is an overreach by the towns. I don't like it, but I don't know that that's legally correct. I do think the towns do have a zoning right, and whether or not these short-term rentals are gonna fall under one zoning as opposed to another is something that I don't have an immediate answer to. But right now, the towns, one town gets away with it as a ban on the Airbnbs, it's only a matter of time before the entire state is caught up. Because it's, if you're sitting there as the town supervisor and you're getting calls nonstop, why not ban it? It's just easier.
So Charles, for instance, I mean, you've got like Premier Finger Lakes Properties, whatever the name of that company is, it does like 1 week rentals on the lakes. How does that, what category does that fall into? Because they've been doing that forever and ever.
Well, are the properties zoned for that?
I have no idea.
That would
People
be
are buying
the,
properties and they're allowing them to manage them, to rent them out on a week-to-week basis.
so that might be where the zoning rule and the specific falls under. Or Airbnb might put a real damper on that business to where the town is going to have to make a decision. Do we upset the business because the Airbnbs are such a problem, or do we allow it all? But in that fact specific question, it's going to fall under the definition of short-term rental and the zoning of the property. But really, I mean, from my perspective, really, the idea is to just get out in front of it. Just let all the agents know that the general rule is this is not allowed. So you could put the contingency in the contract, and then if you find out it is allowed, great. You put the contingency in and you've avoided a potential problem. Good.
So is there a discussion of grandfathered in current Airbnbs? So when Greece now bans it, is it like banned from January 29th to from today till whenever? Or is it, hey, we banned it, so every current Airbnb in the Greece market now has to stop Airbnb?
No, so any permits that were issued can continue to be used. So there are some grandfathered in properties, but
The ones
nobody,
that got permits.
yeah, but nobody, no permits are being approved anymore. So there's a couple that are permissible, and I don't know the specifics. Those permits might expire and then they're not
I was
gonna
gonna say,
reissue
are
them.
those, yeah, are those
It's-
permits
it's-
transferable?
Yes, it's, as of right now, I don't know the specifics of that. So it's, yeah, it's, again, it's just going back to proceed with caution, because if somebody says, I have a permit, I'm good. I would still build in a contingency in the contract that says, not only do I want to see that permit, but I want it to be indefinite.
So, just a quick follow-up to that. Is it our responsibility as the agents to be calling the towns and getting information? Or do we leave that up to you, the great attorney?
Well,
And then we have a couple questions online too.
as long as it's in the contract, then I would leave it up to I would let the attorney look into it, because the less you have to stick your neck out there and give somebody advice on, the better.
Okay.
Let's just make that the attorney's responsibility. That way, if you're wrong, it's their fault, not yours. Of course, it's gonna vary on a case-by-case basis. I mean, some attorneys might not be as responsive or might not know as much about this. I mean, this is all relatively new, which is why we're trying to get out and avoid the problems.
So Dominique asked, you can read that, so I don't have to read.
Yeah, my apologies. I believe someone asked, what is considered short-term, and my phone cut out. Is there a specific amount of days? So with respect to short-term, the definitions are going to be town-specific. As a general rule, month-to-month is allowed. So anything under a month-to-month, to proceed with caution, I would say that's a short-term rental, unless the town gives a specific definition that is smaller than that. Month-to-month is allowed on a statewide basis, because that's probably a majority of people who are in tenancies right now.
Another question is there wording to be used to put in the contracts?
The wording I would use to put in a contract is, I would either do a separate addendum or in an area where you could write it in by hand. So on the Monroe County Bar standard contract, there's an other section where you could literally write in, this contract is contingent on approval from the town to be able to rent as a short-term rental.
Charles, do any of these towns have any documentation saying that it's a blanket ban?
No, they're not going to come out as a blanket ban or I'm sorry, they're not going to come out and issue in writing that there's a blanket ban. There's a demand that you apply for a permit, and then they'll tell you verbally, nobody's getting approved right now until we figure out, they'll leave it open-ended until we get control over this.
Yeah, is that legal?
Well, and that's the problem, is that it's, as of right now, it is. So whether or not it's legal is a matter for the courts to determine. Again, it goes back to zoning, and whether or not, how do you zone these properties, and whether or not the town has the ability to limit where these properties can go. You can't put a hotel everywhere, and so if they're considering the property as a hotel, then they have the right to limit that. Which is why it's so surprising. That's why we gotta have the conversation and let everyone know. Just put it in the contract, assume that you can't do it, and then hopefully we're wrong, and you'll get proof you can, and then you close on the transaction, and you've covered your rear and you've helped your client out.
So if we're on the listing side and, it's a duplex, it's not currently a short-term rental, but if a buyer looks at it with that in mind, I mean, I'm not gonna go out and say, you should give me a contingency. It's not our responsibility as a listing agent.
As a listing agent, it's not your responsibility. However, in the situation that I had where the seller was actually renting on an Airbnb, at that point, you could probably safely assume that the buyer's gonna be aware that they're renting on an Airbnb. And so you should come out and ask your seller, do they have approval from the town? Have they been doing this are they even aware that they need approval? Do they have approval? And then I would also ask, have you been contacted by the town? Are you in violation of anything that I need to know about? Because I do think some sellers have bought property with the understanding that they're gonna rent it on Airbnb, now learn that they can't, and are gonna try to kick the can down the road and maybe have a buyer that in the same predicament and just get out from under this problem, especially if they're getting fined weekly or monthly. So I would come out and ask, are you in any violation of town code that you're aware of that I need to know before I put this on the MLS? Because then if I say you're not in violation, then it's me as the listing agent.
Seems like that line should be added to the disclosures.
Yeah.
Sean and Tiff raised their hand.
Yeah, thank you. I was actually just typing out the question. So is there a specific place that has maybe an Airbnb list of each township by county or anything like that, or you just have to sort through each town page reluctantly?
Yeah, you have to, so I would call the town, because I don't even know if they're going to have any information online, depending on where the town is. But no, there's not a database that has this, particularly because it's so new. I mean, that's actually a really good idea, that should exist. But because it's so new and the rules are changing, and the rules are somewhat hidden, as we kind of went over, the towns aren't going to be proud of the fact that they're denying everybody's Airbnb necessarily. They're not gonna want that necessarily in writing. So I would just, I would defer to the attorney. Make the attorney be the one to be responsible. And just say, hey, it's contingent on the approval. It's your job. Please make sure before we close that this is done. And then wash your hands of it and let the attorney be the one tracking down the town and figure out whether or not it's permissible. Because again, even if there's a permit, the permit might expire. You don't want to be responsible for disclosing to your client, oh no, you're good to go, there's a permit, when maybe it expires in a year and you won't be able to reissue it.
So is there anything in particular we should be putting in our contracts then? Like for that?
Yeah, I would just have a contingency that in writing that says this is contingent on town approval to rent as a short-term rental.
What do
Thank
some
you.
of the fines look like?
I don't know the fine amounts. I mean, if they're gonna vary on a town by town basis, I'm sure they start small. It might be $100. But you know, then it's gonna get, just like there is on a grass violation, if you're not cutting your lawn, it starts as a $50 fine. But they accumulate, and then they could go from once every 6 months to once a month to once a week to once a day, to where it could get out of control. Especially if you're there and they could see your listing on Airbnb for $10,000 on a weekend, the town's not gonna be thrilled. If you continue to kind of stick your nose up to them. So I could imagine the fines would get pretty hefty.
I know Lake Tahoe's doing like $10,000. They only limit a certain amount, and if you do it behind their back, they fine you 10 grand. So I have to imagine the fines are gonna increment, because you're making thousands of dollars that they're not gonna be like, oh,
Right.
because if I see that and my payment's $50, I'll pay the $50 all day
Right.
long. I'm getting an extra $4 grand a month. Yeah, $50, no big deal. But
Take it onto your renters.
Yeah, but the
we don't
problem,
mind item in Airbnb.
but the problem is, again, it's town specific. So really, the main issue, one of the main issues is there's not a statewide rule right now. So it's, and some towns aren't caught up yet, but they will be when they hear what other towns are able to ban it. Then even in the middle of a state where they might be a little bit sleepier and you know, it's only a matter of time before they say, no, we're gonna do the same thing.
Will the homeowners find a way to kind of get around that? Is there loopholes that they can?
No, I mean, right now, there's no,
That's the attorney dependent rules.
Well,
Can you find me a loophole then?
you know, I mean, there's other places you can list your stuff other than Airbnb, there's VRBO, I know there's other private ones.
Yeah.
I mean, is there a way where you could say, oh, well,
well, they're
they're
gonna,
coming here to worship for a weekend?
no, it's going to be, it's going to be, when the towns enact the code, it's going to be not specific to an app, it's going to be specific to a time period.
Time period.
And so this gets back to the definition of short-term rental, but that's, no, as an attorney doing a Zoom call, I cannot advise that there are, it's on a town by town basis, you know, yeah.
So there's a couple questions online. If you look, number of bedrooms and guests, does that make a difference?
No, the number of bedrooms and guests is not going to make a difference. It's going to be the timeline with which they rent the property.
Next question you can read.
You mentioned Greece specifically, but froze on my end. Has Greece indeed put a moratorium on future Airbnbs? If so, for how long? Yes, right now Greece is not approving permits, and if, as far as how long goes, it could be indefinite. I mean, if the towns, if this never gets challenged in court, then the towns could do this forever in theory, and Airbnb will have a very big problem.
Natasha, you can go ahead and unmute and ask.
Hi.
Hello.
Oh, hi. So I have two Airbnb in Williams County, and I was thinking about trying to ban Airbnb. The issue that we can do is
Natasha?
rooms for rent for low income. Yep.
Natasha, can you stop and
Can you
type it out?
hear me?
Please, you're real choppy on our end. Thank you.
Yeah, just type if you can. It's cutting out a bit. If you could type it.
Do you know of any other towns, like in this area that are completely banning? I mean,
Well, I think word has gotten out. So no, specifically, I've only had problems
in
on Edgemere Drive in Greece, where I've called the town, spoke to people, and know specifically what's going on.
Yeah.
But I understand that they're doing that because I believe it started downstate really, and it's moved its way up, and now it's safe to assume throughout the state that the answer is no, because all the towns are doing it.
Town of Pittsburgh definitely has a hard no on it.
They're limiting them on Canandaigua Lake.
Right.
There's a limit to the amount of permits they're gonna issue.
So, Natasha's gonna type up her question.
Yep.
There's two other things I wanted to cover. I don't want to take everybody's time for too long, but one, both are particularly important, but one I'm seeing now within the last 7 days, so I do think that this is timely. There's going to be a lot more bank-owned properties now, that are on the market. Having done now a lot more evictions in the last year, I find myself in city court often. And I have heard court staff saying that there's a lot more foreclosures on the docket that's really picked up. So if you are representing a buyer and they're interested in a city-owned property, there's a couple basics we need to cover. You might have dealt with this 4 or 5 years ago, and so this will just be a refresher, or if you're a new agent, you've never seen it. But literally, the buyer's name will be a bank. You'll make an offer, they'll have a listing agent. And they typically want to close within 30 days. That closing date is going to be extremely time sensitive. So if you have a buyer that has a mortgage, an FHA mortgage, you need them to know and the bank to know, you need to get out in front of this and say, can we close in 30 days? Is that doable? Now, if it's an FHA mortgage, the other problem you're going to have with bank-owned properties is you typically don't get access. So if your buyer is going up FHA for that reason, you should steer them away from bank-owned properties anyways. But it's gonna be very time sensitive. You're not gonna get access.
Access to the property,
Access to the property.
so it's as is.
Yes, and you'll get access after closing. Now, as a result, the prices are a lot lower. And so that might help ease some of the prices of what's going on, since those have been on halt ever since COVID. But I just got a contract across my desk, I think on Thursday of last week. So these are now starting to, and I haven't seen them for years. So these are now starting to come around. The other thing, the bank attorney is normally not gonna be local. And they're going to provide their own title insurance policy. Now, this gets more into the concerns of attorneys more than the agents, but just so you're aware, the closing process in general, legally speaking, is condensed. The sellers are going to be prepared often with the documents you need. So they're gonna have a 30-day close and try to close sooner. And it's going to be streamlined. So it's more for the investor flipper type that has access to liquid cash, either in a private money loan or just themselves. It's not gonna be more for first-time home buyers or anybody getting a loan, but that's not gonna scare your first-time home buyer away. So the reason why I wanna bring it up today is just, again, if you're dealing with a buyer and the prices are all through the roof, and then they see this bank-owned property that's much cheaper in an area they like, there are some major problems with bank-owned properties that you should be aware of. If you have an investor, there's major incentive. The property normally is cheaper and it's a fast close.
Where
But-
do you find the listings for those?
They're gonna just be on the MLS,
They will be
so you
on-
will see them.
Is there a way to search for specifically for those types of properties? Do you know by chance, any of you?
No, there's not.
You just see a listing and you'll see if it's listed by the bank.
Yeah, you'll check the owner and the owner will tell you X bank, or whatever.
Okay.
You can search by.
REO or bank owned.
You can do REO.
Yeah, REO.
I just wanted to look at those.
How do the banks pick the agents they have sell those properties? Just kind of throw a dart?
That's the $1 million question, because everybody wants those listings. There's a relationship somehow with the bank. But
You see some of the same players, but then you see other people, you're like, I've never heard of that person. Where did they get?
yeah, and I don't,
Relationship with the bank.
Yeah,
Talk
so they,
to several of those agents that, have relationships with banks, or you do a lot of the BPO stuff. Get in
Okay,
doing
yeah.
BPOs, taking pictures, and they kind of, oh, I know who you are. And you
oh,
could graduate into, hey, you've been doing this for us for years. We have a listing coming up in Rochester. Would you be interested? Oh, you do a great job. Grow.
but even like a final walkthrough is normally not allowed. The bank literally does not give you keys until you send the wire. In fact, even from the buyer's attorney's side, it's a little bit different. We're sending the money to the bank's attorney, the seller's attorney, prior to the deed going on record often. Which is normally, you're not supposed to do that until after it goes on record, but because it's bank owned and essentially these are their rules, you either do it their way or you don't get the property.
What's the
So-
reason for not at least letting you see the inside?
Well, banks are very rigid, they're very bureaucratic, and they essentially don't want there to be condition problems. They probably don't want to take on any liability. So if you go in there and you say, well, there's a problem and I'll give you credit for it, then everyone's acknowledging there's a problem. It's much easier to just say, no, you're not getting access, take it or leave it. You could peek in through the windows. And then, the price is greatly reduced as a result of that, which is why buyers normally try to get their agent to get them that property. It's so much cheaper than all the other properties on the street, but it's very frustrating. I mean, they defy, a lot of times they defy, the banks do, they defy logic. I mean, you could be in a position where if you were representing a buyer with a mortgage, okay, we can't close on the date in the contract, but we can close 2 days later. We're almost there. Some banks might say, no, deal's dead. I'm keeping your deposit. They'd rather just relist it. Not because it makes sense, because that's the rules. So it's a lot of these bank-owned properties, it's not going to make logical sense. It's just they have their checklist and they just go through their checklist. It's very rigid.
Just to clarify, if there's like any tax liens or any kind of construction liens or anything on those bank-owned properties, those are all wiped out when the bank.
Yes, title does need to be clean. And you could assume that if the bank did the foreclosure, the title is clean, or,
Okay,
because they get a title insurance policy when they foreclose.
yeah.
So you could assume that title's clean. Now, it still needs to be provided to the buyer's attorney. So if there's a title issue, that's a different story. There can be delays as a result of a title issue where the deal could die and you get your deposit back. But for the most part, they're listing it with the understanding the title's clean. And that's why they're so aggressive on their timelines and so rigid.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Tasha typed her question. There's a couple more up there, so I'll let you read them out.
Okay. Is GRAR trying to lobby the town's villages to allow Airbnbs? It does generate sales, bring tourism. I don't know what GRAR's agenda is. There's going to be a lot of people trying to lobby for Airbnbs. So it wouldn't surprise me if they did. I don't necessarily see it as a bad thing. And again, as an attorney that handles real estate transactions, I don't like to see towns create more rules for homeowners. So I do think probably GRAR will eventually try to put pressure to change those rules. In Gorham, they zoned the Airbnb to limit the amount of people staying in relationship to the numbers of bedrooms and reduce the parking problem. Now, so in that regard, if you limit the number of people that are staying in relationship to the bedrooms, you still can't restrict parties. And I think that's really where the problem is. Not everybody's, I don't know how you enforce that. Where was Natasha's? Do you mind scrolling up? Because Natasha had a question and I think she typed it.
That's the one.
That is.
Oh,
There's one above Natasha too.
Last I knew, that was specific to the number of units on a property, so anything over 2 units was not permitted. Niagara Falls, okay? If we have clients with current Airbnbs and no permits, should we have them stay the course or try and get a permit? I have a friend with a house in Canandaigua and they made him change the listing to be accurate for bedrooms and guest count. So if we have clients with current Airbnbs and no permits, should we have them stay the course or try and get a permit? It's a hard question to answer. If they could get a permit prior to there being a blanket ban, then the advice to apply for a permit is good advice. However, if they've already put in a blanket ban, then by calling the town, they're essentially,
Raising their hands saying they have one.
yes.
Hey, flag me, find me.
What I would do is, as a realtor, I would draw a line and say, look, this might be a problem. You should be aware that it might be a problem. I don't want to give you advice on how to handle it. You might want to call an attorney.
Next question.
Good amount of time.
No one above that typically.
Typically, they seem low for the area, so you can check to see if bank owned. Yeah, so prices, so that's going back to the bank owned property. Prices are gonna be normally lower because you're not gonna get access. Is it legal to rent properties and then Airbnb them in Buffalo? Specifically in Buffalo, I don't know if there's a limit. I would assume that it's the same as Rochester, and there is, but it's gonna be hard to enforce. But again, I don't mean to be repetitive, I'm sorry, but if I am, but as a general rule, assume the answer is no, you can't do it.
This is Christie just saying, good amount of utilities are off, water issues in those bank-owned properties,
Yes, so.
huge liability.
Yes, and because, so bank-owned properties, because there's been a halt to foreclosures as a result of COVID, the problems with bank-owned properties are probably gonna be much worse. They're gonna be compounded. Cause, I mean, we talked about zombie properties years ago prior to COVID with foreclosures just taking forever. And then imagine a COVID halt on that for 3 years, it's gonna be even worse. So unless you have an investor that's ready to get into a problem and solve it, I would try to stay away from bank-owned properties, which is why we're bringing it up. Certainly primary residence buyers. And then
Natasha,
are we going to cover eviction? So that's a good segue. I'm gonna try to get into evictions quickly. Again, I don't know how much time they allotted, but I don't want to take up too much of your time. So I do a lot of evictions here in Rochester. They're unlike Airbnbs, they're gonna be essentially the same everywhere throughout the state. Excluding New York City, but at least in Buffalo, Rochester and Syracuse, and then all the surrounding towns, they're gonna be the same. What I'd like to sort of just delve into quick is the two types of evictions you could do, just so everybody has a general understanding of kind of what their client is looking at. Either non-payment of rent or holdover. What a holdover eviction is your lease has expired. As such, you need to get out. It has nothing to do with money. Non-payment is going to be money specific, and it's going to say, hey, you haven't paid rent in 6 months, and so therefore you need to get out because you're not paying. This is just your lease is expired. You need to get out because your lease is expired. So the difference is with those are very important. If you move forward with a non-payment eviction, it's a 14-day notice, and what happens is in court, the tenant can raise habitability issues. So even though you get to court much quicker because it's only a 14-day notice, you could be in a situation where there is adjournments and hearings because your property's not up to code, or the tenant might simply be not being truthful about the property not being up to code. But that you open the door to habitability or condition of home issues. If there is a holdover eviction, which is just your lease is expired, and so therefore I need access to the property back, you need to find another place. The notice changes from 14-day to either 30, 60, or 90, based on how long the tenant's been there. So it's either a 30, 60, or 90-day notice. But there's no habitability defense that you can raise. So it takes longer to get to court. Could be a 90-day notice you're giving the tenant. So, by the time, and then the court could be a month out after that. So it's 4 months before you even see the judge. But then in court, there's really not much to talk about because if the lease is expired and you serve the proper notice, then there's no habitability issues. If they say, well, the furnace isn't working and you never come here and the toilet doesn't flush, then there's no, that defense doesn't work with this type of eviction. So it's normally much more concise and fast in court. So those are the two types of evictions ultimately. Now, squatters is something that is going to come into get raised a lot with respect to listings. We're representing buyers on investment properties. And essentially anybody that's in an apartment or home is going to have rights, unless of course they're literally in the act of stealing right then and there. Okay, and what I mean by that is if someone broke in yesterday and spent the night, then now they have squatters' rights. And you do not have the right to just change the locks and throw anybody out. You're gonna have to hire an attorney and do an eviction. So it's important that you know that, and that if somebody's saying, for example, where you see this a lot for representing a buyer, let's say the seller is an elderly woman who owns the property, who might be in a nursing home, and her son's in the property. And we don't know if the son's gonna be out, and the son hasn't signed a lease. son doesn't pay rent, but he's living there. Well, he has rights, whether it's squatter rights or a tenant's rights, that's for the attorney, that's up to the attorney to decide. But you need to know that, that there could be an eviction and it could delay the process. And then in conjunction with that, if a tenant or somebody in the property is telling you, hey, you know, don't worry, I'm gonna be out at the end of the month. Even if they sign something that says that, you don't have the right to just change the locks if they're not out by the end of the month. You would then have to file in court and go through the eviction process. So as a general rule, just like we were talking about Airbnbs and general rules that you can't do them, and then, you know, let's show me proof after the fact. As a general rule, you cannot change the locks on anybody. And you gotta make sure your buyer knows that. A court order needs to happen.
Is the time frame one night? So if they break in and if they spend one night?
Yes. I mean, it's gonna be up to, in that instance, if they break in and spend the night, and you could call the police and the police can remove them because you're claiming that they are stealing,
Yeah.
then that's up to the police. But ultimately, if they get in there and see that there's a bed or food, the police are gonna say, this is a civil matter, I don't want anything to do with this. And at that point, you cannot change the locks.
So wildly important to have a camera in those types of lists.
Well, even a camera might not change it. I mean,
Really?
you're gonna have squatter rights. I mean, a squatter is
If no
somebody,
one breaks in and you catch them 3 hours later,
yeah, I mean,
they could still have some spotter rights?
it's probably not, if it's the same day, but it depends what they're doing there. I mean, if it's. Again, as a general rule,
Super
I
gray
can't
area.
give people the advice to
Right,
change
right.
the locks or throw somebody out. Because then what happens is there can be punitive damages. So if you do an illegal eviction, now instead of getting money from the tenant or squatter who's been taking money from you,
Yeah.
now they have the right to sue you for travel damages, and it could be criminal. So you could get in trouble with the law and you could end up paying the squatter for doing an illegal eviction. So as a general rule, I would say, look, call an attorney. If the attorney that you're using for the transaction doesn't do evictions, maybe suggest getting an attorney who does, just for the eviction part.
Well, you're the guy. I mean,
Yeah, well, but I'm not the only guy. Certainly, I've learned from other attorneys. There's plenty of good
you're the
attorneys.
only guy.
Yeah, no,
You're the guy.
no.
Anyone on this Zoom, you're the guy.
Yes.
Hey, buddy, this is a client, can you mind?
Have you had,
He is the best.
water in connection with an Airbnb before, where they just don't leave?
So that's a good question. I haven't, but you can do that. So, you know, the problem with Airbnb, well, the reason why you don't do that with Airbnbs, or why you don't see it, I should say, just like with hotels, is there's a credit card associated with that. However, if you get somebody down on their luck and they don't care that the credit card's gonna be maxed out, then certainly you could have somebody who refuses to leave an Airbnb, and they would have to be evicted.
Could I charge them then on their card, you're saying?
Yeah, and you'll get
If
paid
they're-
until the card maxes out.
Right, okay.
So I should set up credit card payment for my rentals, so when they don't pay, just auto withdraw from their account.
Well, I
I know you can't, I know because you're on video that you can't do that, but if you blink twice, I'll completely understand. There's a couple,
staying away from that.
there is a couple comments online or on Zoom you could answer.
With rentals, would it be best to go month to month then, since you can evict for anything when essentially it's non-payment? But if there's a lease, they can play the payment game? That's a very good question, and yes, I mean, certainly, it's going to be hard to find tenants that want to sign a month-to-month lease because it's to their disadvantage. But if you can do a month-to-month lease, then that gives you both options of an eviction. It gives you non-payment if they're not paying, and it gives you the holdover because the lease is on a month-to-month and it's not on a specific term. Where we get into really hard evictions is if somebody is doing illegal activity, let's say they're selling drugs, or they're just throwing parties every day and it's a nuisance to the community or to other units, but they're paying every month, then, and they're on a lease, then it's very hard for a lease violation to evict somebody. So yes, that's a good point. So how should we advise someone to protect themselves? Well, it depends on the issue that you're trying to protect, but as a general rule, if it's with respect to a contract as a realtor, I would understand the timeline. It's not fast. You're looking at anywhere from 3 to 6 months for an eviction. And so if you're gonna wait to close until the tenant's out, know that it's probably a 3 to 6 month process. And just so, this is another important point to bring up. You cannot continue an eviction if you've changed the title. So if a seller has started the eviction process and the buyer says, well, give me a credit, let's close, and I'll just finish it in court. If the deed has transferred, especially in the city of Rochester at least, they will throw the eviction out and you'll have to restart. So if you're representing a buyer who's gonna wait until the property is vacant, they have to wait until the property is vacant. You cannot cut corners and close, or they could be in a situation where they're starting over.
How expensive is it to get someone out?
Yes.
Yeah, so, yes,
I know that's expensive, but like roundabout, because I have clients all the time that are like,
it depends on the attorney, but I would say roughly $500 to $1,000. Everybody's gonna charge different, and it depends how many appearances you're making and how drawn out of a process it can be, because some tenants could make it very, very hard. So those are my 3 points. I certainly, if there's any other questions, raise them, or I will make sure that an email gets sent out with my contact information. And for the Buffalo agents that were listening, if there are any Buffalo specific questions, I understand with respect to Airbnbs, there might be a clause in the contract that protects buyers a little bit better than in Monroe County. So relay those to me, and there are partners within my same firm that work in Buffalo that I can get you answers to. But certainly I'm available by phone. I give agents my cell phone. I'll put it up on the whiteboard or email, and reach out if you need me. But
So one last question that came through.
how does a month-to-month lease agreement differ from a long-term lease if they have been in the unit for 2+ years? That's a good question. Well, if they've been in the unit for 2+ years, if their initial lease expires, then they go month to month. Usually by the terms of the lease. I mean, I would refer you back to the lease, but normally you have a clause in there that says if your lease expires, it goes month to month. So if you've never signed a new lease with them and they were on their original lease, then they're on the month to month. And so after 2 years, it's a 90-day notice. So that would be the difference. If it's under a year and they've signed a month-to-month lease, they've only been there 3 months and they've been a pain, then it's just a 30-day notice. If they've been over there, if they've been in the property for over 2 years, it's a 90-day notice.
Is there any kind of? Who tracks that? I guess if I showed up to you with a month-to-month lease and they were there, so year one, they signed for a year lease. And then it goes month to month because I was lazy and didn't have them sign a new lease.
Yep.
Now they're on month to month. It's month 2 of year 2. I come to you and say, hey, I'm on a month-to-month lease with these tenants, evict them. And you go, how long have they been there? And I go, 2 months.
Well, then I'm going to presumably see the tenants in court, and then everything will get thrown out. So you'll waste 3 months or 4 months of your time giving them the proper notice, filing in court, going to court, just for the tenant to say.
Just to shave off 2 months or that
Yeah.
eviction.
Now, if the
30
tenant
days.
doesn't go, then there would be no defense, and presumably you might be able to win with that. But I try to get the specifics from the clients up front to avoid problems, because it
That's what I want to
takes a
know.
long time in general. It's gonna take even longer if I'm lied to, and then we have to refile.
I would never.
If the tenant makes partial payments, do you have to start the eviction process over? If you're